With our pattern pieces selected, now we're ready to lay our pattern pieces out on our fabric to cut them. So what we want to do is we want to lay our fabric in half, fold it in half, matching up the selvages so that the selvages line up on top of each other, and we have one fold on the other side. Okay. We want wrong sides together for our cutting of our fabric, so right sides out, wrong sides together. Now I have a special piece of fabric here in the way that we lay it out because I have a plaid. So with that, I need to make sure that my horizontal stripes that make my plaid match going around the fabric on both layers, so that when I cut that out and sew it together, my plaids will match up on my garment. The other thing about my fabric is that because my fabric is not printed, the colors are actually done with the yarns and then they're woven in, I don't have a difference between my right side and my wrong side. So it doesn't matter how I lay my fabric together. What is going to be important with that is when you don't have a true right and wrong side, as you're sewing, you're going to need to make sure that you're placing pattern pieces in opposite directions so that you have a front and a back and a left and a right, sewing those together so that you actually sew what would be your right sides together. Now, to ensure that my horizontal stripes within my plaid match, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a pin through the fabric, and then I'm going to make sure that it comes out in the same place on the other side of the design. So at this blue stripe, I stuck a pin through the fabric at the bottom of that blue stripe. I'm now going to flip my fabric over and make sure that it comes through. And it's not exactly right, so I'm going to undo that. I'm going to push up on the top layer and repin, and keep doing that until I get them the same on both sides. So again, place a pin in, flip it over, and make sure that the pin is coming out in the same place on the other side so that those stripes line up. And do that all the way across your fabric on the same stripe. Again, make sure that it's lining up. And then throughout your fabric, check it about every 12 to 18 inches by, again, just putting pins in, checking to make sure that it's lining up in the right place, and pinning those in so that you have your design of your fabric lined up. And we want to do the same thing with stripes. If we have stripes, you want to do the same thing as you're doing with plaids. You also want to make sure that if you have a large print, that it's lined up as well. Alright, so once you have those pinned in and it's lining up, then you're actually ready to lay your pattern pieces on. So leave your fabric pinned together with plaids and stripes so that it lines up correctly. Then you're going to take your pattern piece and lay it on the fabric according to the diagram that we had on our guide sheets. Okay. Now it's very important that we actually check our grain line to make sure that our fabric is on the straight of the grain so that our garment hangs properly. So we're going to put a pin at the top of the grain line. We will take our tape measure and measure from the grain line to, you can either go to the selvage or to the fold. So I'm measuring to the selvage, and from the grain line to the selvage, I have 12 and 5/8 inches. So then I'm going to move down to the bottom end of my grain line. I'm going to set my tape measure at 12 5/8 inches from the selvage, and I'm going to slide my pattern so that the grain line becomes at the edge of my tape measure, so that I know that I'm the same distance from the selvage at the top of my grain line and the bottom of my grain line in my fabric piece. As I do that, my fabric is now on what we call the straight of the grain. So then I can pin the remaining parts of my pattern piece down so that I can cut it out. You want to pin to the inside of your cutting lines. So make sure you remember what size you're cutting. So I'm cutting a medium, so I'm pinning to the inside of the second set of lines. And as I pin, I go from that grain line and I slightly push out on my pattern piece just to make sure that it's laying flat. You don't want to push too hard because you don't want to stretch the pattern piece, but you want to make sure that you have it nice and flat. So I have the first pattern piece pinned, and now I'll do the same thing and pin the second pattern piece. Again, the first thing I do is put a pin at the top of my grain line, measure from the grain line to either the selvage or the fold, and then move down to the bottom of my grain line, and put a pin in there once I line it up at the same distance. And then I'm going to pin around my pattern piece. As I'm pinning my pattern pieces, I have one more step that I have to do to line up the pattern pieces along with the grain line. So I need to make sure that my pattern piece is on grain, but because I have a plaid, I also have to make sure that the pattern pieces are sitting on the same plaid repeat for the front and the back so that they match when they're sewn together. So the way I do that is I find my notches and I look and see the first pattern piece that I placed, which happens to be my front. I found that the side notch is sitting, the point of it is in the middle of one of my white stripes above a red stripe. So I found that same stripe on the section of fabric that my back pant is laying, and I put the point of the notch in the middle of the white stripe that sits above the red stripe so that my pattern pieces are sitting in the same plaid repeat of the fabric. With my pattern pieces laid out and pinned, I'm ready to cut. So I'm going to cut through both layers of fabric at the same time, and I'm going to cut on my solid cutting lines, cutting around my pattern pieces. Now remember, when you have multiple pattern piece sizes, make sure that you're cutting on the right size. So I'm cutting on a medium. So I'm coming down that pattern line. When I get to the notch, I'm actually going to cut that notch out by actually cutting a triangle for my notch there. So I've gotten to the notch, so now I'm going to come out, and then I'm going to come back in so that I have cut a triangular notch for that single notch. So I'm going to do that every time that I come to a notch. I will cut a triangular shape out in the outside part of the pattern that would become the seam allowance. So then I will continue cutting down my stitching line, my cutting lines. Now I've come to the point where I am at the joining of where the shorts would be versus the pants. So if I was cutting the shorts, I would follow this cutting line. But since I am cutting out pants, I'm just going to go from this point. I'm going to take a straight line down to the remainder of the pant leg. So I'm going to cut off the little wedge that would be for the hem of the shorts. Okay, so I've actually cut this little section off, and I've cut straight down for the pant leg. Still cutting on the same pant, other leg. Okay, I've come to another notch, so I'm cutting my notch out. And then I'm going to come up, following the size that I need. At the center back, I have what's considered a double notch. So as I cut the double notch, rather than cutting two individual notches, two individual triangles, I come up, cut at an angle, then I cut across to the outside of the second triangle and back down. Okay, so with the double notch, I get a flat piece across the top of my notch, an angle at each end of those triangles. Okay, so I've cut out my front. I can fold that up and set it aside. And now I'm ready to do the same thing to cut out my back. so I have cut out both my front and my back pattern pieces.